She has never worked a single day in her pathetic life. My father screamed this in front of a packed courtroom, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. He was demanding the judge strip me of my late mother's $12 million trust fund. My sister and her husband laughed from the gallery, whispering loudly about how I could not even afford my own rent. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had won. But their laughter died. The second, my lawyer handed the judge a sealed envelope with a federal stamp on it. The judge read the first line. His face went completely pale, and he ordered the bailiff to lock the doors. Truth inside that envelope was highly classified, and it was about to destroy everything my father had built. My name is Naomi and I am 33 years old. For years I let my arrogant family believe I was an unemployed loser who sat in my basement all day wearing sweatpants. If you are watching this from somewhere where family drama and toxic relatives hit close to home, take a moment to tell me where you are from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe, because you will want to hear exactly how I handled what came next. The air in the county probate court was stifling. It was a Tuesday morning, and the mahogany walls of the courtroom echoed with my father Harrison's booming voice. He was pacing back and forth in front of the judge's bench, wearing a custom Italian suit that cost more than most people made in a year. He played the part of the grieving widow perfectly, but I knew the truth. He was drowning in debt, and he desperately needed my mother's money to save his crumbling real estate empire. Look at her, Your Honor, my father continued, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. He stopped pacing and turned to glare at me. Just look at her. She is wearing a discount store sweater to a legal hearing regarding a $12 million estate. My late wife Diana was not in her right mind. During her final weeks, she was heavily medicated and vulnerable. Naomi manipulated her own dying mother to steal this family's legacy. She has no career, no ambition, and no basic understanding of financial responsibility. Handing her this trust is reckless. From the second row of the gallery, I heard the unmistakable sound of my sister, Sabrina, scoffing. I did not need to turn around to know. She was rolling her eyes. Sabrina was 30 years old, dressed head to toe in expensive brands, and entirely dependent on our father's money. Sitting right next to her was her husband DeAndre. DeAndre was a sharply dressed African-American man who loved to introduce himself to everyone as a tech startup chief executive officer. But I knew his company had no actual products. He leaned over the wooden railing, making sure his voice carried through the quiet room. She asked us to pay her internet bill last month. DeAndre whispered loudly to Sabrina, ensuring the court reporter caught every word. It is just sad, honestly. The judge frowned, looking down at his reading glasses. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff table. I did not cry. I did not defend myself. I did not even flinch. I just stared straight ahead, letting them dig their own graves. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my cheap clothes meant I was broke. What they did not know was that my plain wardrobe was intentional. In my line of work, blending in was a requirement. I did not ask DeAndre to pay my internet bill because I was poor. I asked him because I was testing him on my mother's behalf. And just like we expected, he had mocked me over $100. My lawyer, Oliver, sat next to me, calmly organizing his files. He was a sharp man who never spoke out of turn. He did not object to my father's theatrical insults. He just let Harrison run out of breath. Your Honor, my father said, leaning on the wooden podium, I am requesting an immediate injunction. Freeze the trust accounts. Grant me conservatorship over the estate. Naomi is incapable of managing her own life, let alone $12 million. The courtroom was dead silent. The judge sighed heavily and turned his attention to my table. Miss Naomi, do you or your counsel have anything to say in response to these serious allegations of financial incompetence? I finally turned my head and looked at my father. He was smiling a smug, victorious grin. That made my stomach turn. I gave him a small, polite smile back, then nodded once to my lawyer. Oliver stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not grab a stack of bank statements or character references. Instead, he picked up a single, thick manila envelope, sealed with red tamper-proof tape. We do not have a verbal response, Your Honor, Oliver said, his voice steady and calm. However, we do have a document for your eyes only. Oliver walked past my father, who sneered at him, and handed the envelope to the court clerk. The clerk passed it up to the judge. The seal on the back clearly displayed the crest of the United States federal government. My family had spent the last hour trying to prove I was a nobody. They had no idea I was a forensic financial investigator for the government, and they were the primary targets of my current federal investigation. The heavy silence in the courtroom was broken only by the sharp, distinct sound of the court clerk tearing open the red, tamper-proof seal. Every eye in the room was fixed on the judge. As the clerk handed him the thick stack of papers, the judge adjusted his reading glasses, letting out a heavy sigh that suggested he was entirely exhausted by what he assumed was a desperate, last-minute stalling tactic from a broke daughter. He leaned back in his leather chair and flipped open the first page. I watched his face carefully. In my profession, reading micro-expressions was just as important as reading financial ledgers. I saw the exact second the reality of the situation hit him. First his eyebrows furrowed in confusion, then his eyes widened slightly as he recognized the official seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, stamped right next to the seal of the Department of Justice. Finally, the color completely drained from his face. His posture transformed instantly. The bored, condescending local probate judge vanished, replaced by a man who suddenly realized he was sitting in the middle of an active federal crime scene. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the documents to me. When he looked at me this time, he did not see the unemployed basement dweller my father had just described. We saw a lead federal investigator who had the power to subpoena his entire courtroom and everyone in it. Your Honor, my father barked, unable to handle the sudden shift in attention. I strongly object to this theatrical display. We are wasting the court's valuable time. My daughter does not have a single asset to her name, let alone any document that could possibly alter the fact that she is unfit to manage a $12 million estate. This is clearly a pathetic stall tactic. His highly paid attorney, Mr. Caldwell, placed a hand on my father's arm, trying to signal him to be quiet. Caldwell was experienced enough to notice the judge's physical reaction. He knew something was terribly wrong, but my father was too arrogant to read the room. He puffed out his chest, stepping closer to the bench. I demand to know what is in that envelope, my father insisted, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. The judge did not even acknowledge my father. His hands were actually trembling as he carefully placed the documents back inside the manila folder. He closed the flap and pressed his palm flat against the envelope, as if trying to hide it from the rest of the room. Mr. Oliver, the judge said, his voice completely stripped of its previous annoyance. It was now tight and heavily strained. He looked at my lawyer with a newfound sense of intense respect. Am I to understand that the contents of this envelope are currently active and binding? That is correct, Your Honor. Oliver replied smoothly, not giving away a single detail. And we respectfully request that the court proceed with the utmost caution regarding any rulings on the Diana Trust Fund today. My father let out a loud mocking laugh. Proceed with caution. Are you joking? She cannot even pay her own phone bill. From the gallery I heard Sabrina snicker again. DeAndre leaned forward, whispering loudly enough for the front rows to hear. She is probably getting audited by the Internal Revenue Service for claiming fake unemployment checks. I told you all she was a fraud. The jury seated to our right began to murmur. Several of the jurors leaned in toward each other, whispering furiously. Even though this was a probate hearing, my father had insisted on a jury trial, because he believed his natural charisma and wealthy charm would easily sway a group of ordinary citizens against a supposedly greedy, lazy daughter. Now those same citizens were watching the judge sweat. In fear, the judge picked up his wooden gavel. He did not tap it lightly. He slammed it down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot, silencing the entire room instantly. Order in this court, the judge commanded. His voice was shaking, but he projected it loud enough to reach the back doors. There will be a strict 30-minute recess. I am ordering the bailiff to secure the exits. Furthermore, the documents submitted by the plaintiff are hereby sealed. The judge looked directly at my father, his expression stern and warning. Mr. Harrison. The judge continued, his tone absolutely chilling. You will sit down and remain silent. The document I just read is classified under federal jurisdiction. This court does not have the clearance to challenge it, and I strongly advise you to consult with your counsel before you say another word. On the record. Court is recessed. The judge stood up, immediately grabbing the envelope and practically sprinting back to his private chambers. The courtroom erupted. The jury murmured louder, clearly shocked by the sudden turn of events. My father stood frozen at the podium, his arrogant smile entirely wiped away. He looked confused, his mind desperately trying to calculate what kind of federal document his seemingly worthless daughter could possibly produce to make a judge run away. Caldwell aggressively grabbed my father's shoulder and pulled him away from the bench, whispering frantically into his ear. I calmly stood up, smoothing out my cheap sweater. I picked up my briefcase and nodded to Oliver. It was time to leave the courtroom and head into the hallway, where I knew my family would be waiting to corner me. They thought they were the predators in this scenario. They had no idea they were already caught in the trap. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind us, muting the frantic murmurs of the jury. Inside, the hallway of the county courthouse was lined with cold marble, a fitting backdrop for the people waiting for me. I had barely taken 10 steps before they formed a human barricade. Across the corridor, my father Harrison stood in the center. Sabrina and DeAndre flanked him like loyal foot soldiers. A few yards away, my father's highly paid attorney Caldwell was aggressively pacing and speaking rapidly into his cell phone, clearly trying to figure out what kind of federal document I had just submitted. My father did not wait for me to speak. He closed the distance between us, his face red with anger, and pulled a folded piece of paper from his tailored suit jacket. He shoved it toward my chest. Sign it. My father demanded, his voice a low threatening hiss. I do not know what kind of forged garbage you just handed to that judge, but this little stunt ends right now. This is a standard waiver of rights. You are going to sign it. Quash your claim to the $12 million trust and walk out of this building before I have you arrested for perjury. I did not even look at the paper. I looked him dead in the eye. You cannot arrest anyone for perjury, Harrison. You are not the district attorney. Sabrina stepped forward, crossing her arms over her designer silk blouse. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "God, you are so embarrassing, Naomi," she sneered. "You walk into a courtroom, looking like you bought your outfit at a thrift store. Look at your shoes, they are scuffed. You do not belong here. You have never belonged in this family. You are just jealous because my life is perfect. And you are a 33-year-old spinster who has literally nothing. Just sign the paper and go back to your pathetic little basement." I let her talk. It was fascinating to watch them unravel. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the massive legal avalanche hanging right above their heads. Oliver, my lawyer, stood quietly beside me holding my briefcase. He did not intervene, because he knew I did not need him to. When Sabrina realized her insults were bouncing right off me, she huffed and stepped back. That was when DeAndre took his turn. He stepped up, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. He puffed out his chest, wearing a custom watch that I knew cost more than a luxury car. "Listen to me very carefully, Naomi," DeAndre said, lowering his voice to try and sound menacing. "Your dad is funding my tech startup. We are launching a massive software platform next month. We have employees depending on us. If you take this $12 million, my company goes under. My investors pull out. You are going to bankrupt us. Just because you hold some petty childhood grudge. Stop ruining the family. Sign the paper." He glared at me, waiting for me to cower. Instead, I smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was a cold, calculating smile that instantly made DeAndre's confident posture falter. "Your tech startup?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "You mean the Delaware shell company?" DeAndre froze. The aggressive scowl on his face vanished, replaced by a sudden terrifying blankness. I took a single step closer to him, lowering my voice so only the three of them could hear. "I am talking about the company registered to a vacant strip mall in Wilmington, Delaware. The one with 0 actual employees, 0 software products, and a corporate bank account that magically receives massive wire transfers from my father's real estate firm every second Tuesday of the month. Is that the tech startup you are so worried about losing?" DeAndre's jaw actually dropped. He looked wildly at my father, panic flashing in his eyes. My father snatched the waiver back, his hands shaking slightly as he stared at me. "How do you know about Delaware?" my father asked, his voice suddenly losing all of its previous thunder. Sabrina looked back and forth between her husband and her father, completely oblivious to the financial crimes they were committing. "What is she talking about, DeAndre? What shell company?" Before DeAndre could formulate a lie to tell his wife, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked open. A uniformed court bailiff stepped out into the hallway, his expression incredibly serious. "The judge is returning to the bench," the bailiff announced loudly, looking directly at my father. "All parties are ordered back inside immediately." My father stared at me for one more long second. The absolute certainty he had, walking into this courthouse, was gone. He looked terrified. I adjusted my thrift store sweater, gave Sabrina one last pleasant smile, and walked past them back into the courtroom. The real show was just about to begin. I walked back through the heavy wooden doors and took my seat next to Oliver at the plaintiff table. My father followed closely behind me. His face was pale and his jaw was clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter. Sabrina and DeAndre hurried to their seats. In the gallery behind him, the confident smirks they had worn just 30 minutes ago had completely evaporated. DeAndre kept checking his expensive watch, his leg bouncing nervously against the wooden bench. The jury filed back into the box, whispering furiously among themselves. until the court bailiff ordered everyone to rise. The judge practically marched out of his private chambers. He did not look at my father. He did not look at the jury box. He looked directly at me. It was a brief, highly respectful glance that told me everything I needed to know. He had made the phone calls. He had verified the federal seals on the documents Oliver handed him. He knew exactly who I worked for, and he understood the immense power I held over everyone. In this room, Caldwell, my father's high-priced attorney, was not in the loop. He had no idea what was in that sealed envelope. Caldwell cleared his throat and approached the wooden podium, determined to win this case. Using his original battle plan, Your Honor, Caldwell began projecting his deep voice to ensure the jury heard every single syllable. Before the recess, we were discussing the immediate danger posed to the Diana Trust Fund. We are officially filing an emergency injunction right now to freeze all assets associated with the estate. The judge stared at Caldwell as if the man had just spoken in a foreign language. Mr. Caldwell, the judge said slowly, choosing his words with extreme caution. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this specific motion today, given the circumstances? Yes, Your Honor, Caldwell insisted, puffing out his chest and gesturing toward me. My client has a fiduciary duty to protect this family legacy. The plaintiff, Naomi, has demonstrated a lifelong inability to hold a stable job. She is a 33-year-old woman who still lives like a college student. She has no verifiable income, no professional standing, and absolutely no financial literacy. Handing her a $12 million estate is akin to setting the money on fire. Caldwell paused for dramatic effect, turning slightly so the jury could see his disgusted expression. We demand that her personal bank records be subpoenaed and entered into the public record immediately. We need to prove to this court that she is entirely financially incompetent and a massive flight risk. My father nodded vigorously from his seat at the defense table. She is a basement dweller, Your Honor. My father interrupted, ignoring courtroom decorum. She does not even own a car. She takes the bus. If you do not freeze those trust accounts today, she will drain the funds by tomorrow morning and disappear. I sat quietly and listened to them paint me as a helpless, pathetic child. It was the exact same narrative they had spun for my entire adult life. My father needed everyone to believe I was weak so he could justify stealing what was rightfully mine. Caldwell was doing his job perfectly, playing to the jury, painting a vivid picture of a greedy, lazy daughter, waiting to cash in on her mother's tragic death. But the judge did not slam his gavel. He did not grant the emergency injunction. He did not order a subpoena for my bank accounts. Instead, he did something that made Caldwell's confident posture falter. The judge looked directly at my table. He looked right at me and then at Oliver. The judge was trapped in an impossible legal position. He could not reveal the contents of the classified federal document, but he also could not legally approve a financial subpoena against a lead investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission without triggering a massive jurisdictional nightmare. If he signed that subpoena, he would be interfering with an active federal investigation. The judge was silently asking me for permission to proceed. He needed me to give him a way out of this trap without blowing my undercover status in front of my father. Just yet the silence in the courtroom stretched on for several long, incredibly uncomfortable seconds. Everyone in the room was waiting for the judge to yell at me, to demand my financial records, to finally put me in my place. Even Sabrina leaned forward in the gallery, Eager to watch my public humiliation, I turned to Oliver. I did not need to say a single word. I simply gave him a slight confirming nod. Oliver calmly stood up, smoothing out his suit jacket and picking up a slim black folder from our table. It was time to show my family exactly how unemployed I really was. Oliver opened the slim black folder and pulled out a small stack of crisp papers. He did not look smug or boastful. He maintained the same professional, detached demeanor he had displayed since we walked into the building. He handed the original copies to the court clerk and turned to face my father's attorney. "We have no objection to transparency, Your Honor," Oliver said, his voice echoing clearly across the quiet room. "In fact, to save this court the time and expense of issuing subpoenas, my client has authorized the voluntary release of her financial disclosures. I am submitting her certified tax returns, including redacted wage forms, covering the past 5 consecutive fiscal years." The clerk handed a copy to the judge and walked another copy over to the defense table. Caldwell practically snatched the papers from the clerk's hand. My father leaned over his attorney's shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he tried to decipher the dense financial documents. "For the record," Oliver continued, never taking his eyes off my father, "my client is not unemployed. She operates as an independent forensic contractor, specializing in high-level corporate audits. She does not live in a basement, nor does she rely on government assistance. Her adjusted gross income for the previous fiscal year alone was $14 million. A collective gasp rippled through the jury box. Even the court reporter paused for a fraction of a second, her hands hovering over her keyboard. Caldwell stared at the paper in his hands, as if it had suddenly caught fire. The smug, condescending sneer he had worn all morning melted into an expression of pure shock. He looked at the total income line, blinked hard, and looked at it again. He knew how to spot fake tax returns, and the official watermarks and certified stamps on these documents were undeniable. My father literally choked on his own breath. He grabbed the papers out of Caldwell's hands, his eyes darting frantically across the page. He looked at the numbers, then looked up at me in my thrift store sweater, completely incapable of reconciling the two images. "That is a lie. That is a complete and absolute lie." The screeching voice erupted from the gallery behind my father. Sabrina had leaped to her feet. Her face was flushed bright red, and her designer handbag tumbled to the floor, spilling her expensive makeup across the wooden planks. She pointed a trembling finger at me, completely losing whatever shred of composure she had left. "She is lying," Sabrina screamed, ignoring DeAndre, who was frantically pulling at the hem of her jacket, trying to get her to sit down. "She is a fraud. Look at her shoes. Look at her hair. She asked my husband for $100 last month. There is no way she makes $1 million. She forged those documents. Arrest her right now. Order in the court." The judge bellowed, slamming his gavel down so hard the sound cracked like a whip. "Sit down right now, young lady, or I will have you escorted out of this building." In handcuffs, Sabrina did not want to sit down. Her entire identity, her entire sense of superiority, was built on the foundation that I was a failure. For 30 years, she had comforted herself with the belief that she was the successful daughter, beautiful daughter, the rich daughter. Finding out that the sister she relentlessly bullied made more money in 1 year than her fake tech executive husband had ever seen in his life simply broke her brain. DeAndre finally managed to yank her down onto the bench. He was not looking at the judge or at Sabrina. He was staring at me. He was sweating profusely. DeAndre was a scam artist, and scam artists recognize when the game has changed. He realized that, if I did not need the $12 million trust for the money, I was pursuing this legal battle for an entirely different reason, and that terrified him. Caldwell swallowed hard and tried to recover his footing. "Your Honor," he stammered, pulling at his collar. "Even if these documents are accurate, it does not change the fact that my client has concerns about the estate. It changes everything, Mr. Caldwell." The judge interrupted sharply. "You filed a motion to freeze the Diana Trust accounts, based entirely on the premise that the plaintiff is financially destitute and a flight risk. These certified documents prove she is highly compensated and fully capable of managing substantial assets. Your motion for an emergency injunction is officially denied." The judge picked up his pen and signed a swift, heavy line across Caldwell's motion, dismissing it entirely. My father sank back into his chair, looking like he had been physically struck. His primary strategy, to cut me off from my mother's money, had just been blown to pieces in front of a jury. But my father was a desperate man, and desperate men do not surrender. They just find dirtier ways to fight. He leaned over to Caldwell, his face twisting into a dark, malicious scowl, and whispered something urgent into the lawyer's ear. The battle over my financial competency was over, but my father was already pulling out his next weapon. "Your Honor, while the plaintiff's financial status is certainly surprising, it is ultimately irrelevant to the core matter of this estate." Caldwell's voice was shaky at first, but he forced himself to project confidence. As he stepped away from the defense table, he was pivoting to my father's backup plan. The judge slowly lowered his pen, glaring over the rim of his glasses. "Irrelevant, Mr. Caldwell. You just spent the first hour of this hearing demanding I freeze an estate based on the absolute certainty that the plaintiff was destitute. Now you are telling me it does not matter. You are walking on incredibly thin ice in my courtroom." Caldwell swallowed hard, visibly sweating under the judge's intense scrutiny. My father, however, did not look intimidated. He looked like a man who was about to play his trump card. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper, a clear plastic sleeve. "We filed the previous motion based on the information we had at the time," Caldwell explained, taking the plastic sleeve from my father. "However, late last night, my client was sorting through some of his late wife's personal belongings that were returned from the hospital. He found something that supersedes the original trust agreement entirely. I am formally submitting a holographic codicil, a handwritten amendment to the will executed by Diana just 3 days before her passing." A heavy murmur swept through the courtroom. Oliver did not gasp or object. He simply held out his hand. The court clerk took the plastic sleeve from Caldwell and brought it over to our table so we could examine it. Before passing it up to the bench, I looked down at the single sheet of paper. It was written in blue ink. The handwriting was shaky and erratic, desperately trying to mimic the elegant cursive my mother was known for. I knew instantly it was a forgery. 3 days before my mother passed, she was heavily sedated on a morphine drip, completely incapable of holding a glass of water, let alone penning a legally binding legal document. Oliver leaned in close to me, his eyes scanning the page. "This is a desperate move," he whispered quietly. Caldwell walked back to the podium, squaring his shoulders. "Your Honor, the amendment is brief but incredibly clear. In it, Diana explicitly states that she felt manipulated by Naomi during her vulnerable state. The document reads, and I quote, 'Upon further reflection of my relationships, I revoke the previous trust structure. I leave the entirety of my estate, including all liquid assets and properties, to my devoted husband Harrison.' And my loving daughter Sabrina. In the gallery, I heard Sabrina let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief. She sat up perfectly straight, brushing the hair over her shoulder. Her previous humiliation, instantly replaced by a vicious, triumphant pride. She nudged DeAndre, whispering something into his ear, and pointing a manicured finger at the back of my head. My father sat back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. He was daring me to challenge him. The clerk handed the document up to the judge. The judge studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He looked at the date, looked at the signature, and then looked down at Caldwell. A deathbed amendment written on notebook paper. The judge set his tone dripping with skepticism. Miraculously discovered the night before. A major probate hearing. Entirely undoing. A $12 million trust. That was meticulously drafted by a corporate law firm. And it is not notarized. Under state law, a holographic will does not require a notary, if the handwriting and signature can be authenticated. Caldwell argued smoothly. We understand the timing is convenient, Your Honor, but the court must respect the final wishes of the deceased. Oliver stood up, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, my client contests the validity of this document in its entirety. Furthermore, an unnotarized, handwritten codicil requires independent verification. Without a notary, the defense must provide overwhelming proof that Diana was not only the author of this document, but that she was of sound mind when she allegedly wrote it. We are fully prepared to do exactly that. Caldwell countered immediately, a smug smile returning to his face. We anticipated this challenge. That is why we did not just bring the document today. We brought an impartial witness. The judge raised an eyebrow. An impartial witness? Yes, Your Honor, Caldwell said, turning toward the gallery. We have a sworn witness who was physically present in the hospital room on the afternoon this document was drafted. Someone who sat by Diana's bedside, who handed her the pen, and who watched her write and sign this exact amendment of her own free will. The courtroom fell dead silent. A witness to a deathbed will was the gold standard in probate court. If someone testified under oath that they saw her sign it, the forgery would be incredibly difficult to disprove without a prolonged and expensive legal battle. My father looked at me, a cruel mocking smile spreading across his face. The defense calls DeAndre to the stand. Caldwell announced loudly. DeAndre stood up from the gallery. He adjusted the lapels of his costume, gave his wife, Sabrina, a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, and walked confidently down the aisle toward the witness box. He was about to commit federal perjury, right in front of a judge, and he had absolutely no idea I was holding the exact evidence needed to destroy his life. The bailiff stepped forward, holding out a worn leather Bible. DeAndre placed his left hand flat against the cover and raised his right hand. He solemnly swore to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It was almost comical how easily the lie rolled off his tongue. Before he even took his seat, he settled into the wooden witness chair, casually shooting his cuffs to expose his heavy, expensive watch. He looked directly at the jury box, flashing them a practiced sympathetic smile. He was treating the courtroom like a boardroom pitch for his fake tech company. Caldwell walked to the center of the floor, clasping his hands behind his back. Please, state your name and your relationship to the deceased. For the record. Caldwell instructed smoothly. My name is DeAndre. He replied, his voice deep and resonant. I am the son-in-law of the late Diana. I have been married to her daughter Sabrina for 4 years. Caldwell nodded encouragingly. DeAndre, I want to direct your attention to the evening of October 14th. Exactly 3 days before Diana passed away. Can you tell the court where you were that night? DeAndre took a slow theatrical breath. His performance was sickeningly polished. I was at the hospital, he said, his tone dropping into a perfect register of feigned sorrow. It was late, around 8 o'clock in the evening. The rest of the family had gone home to rest. But I wanted to stay behind to keep Diana company. She had been drifting in and out of consciousness all week, but that night she was surprisingly lucid. And what happened during that visit? Caldwell asked, guiding his star witness right into the trap. DeAndre leaned forward, looking earnestly at the jurors. Diana grabbed my hand. She was crying. She told me she had made a terrible mistake with her trust fund. She said she originally left the money to Naomi because she felt sorry for her. But as her final days approached, she realized how reckless that was. She looked right at me and said she was terrified of Naomi and her greed. She knew Naomi had never held down a real job and would just squander the family legacy. I sat at the plaintiff table, my face completely blank. Oliver, sitting next to me, did not object. He just calmly clicked his pen. In a courtroom, the worst thing you can do to a liar is interrupt them. You have to let them keep talking. The more specific details they invent, the tighter the noose becomes around their own neck. What did Diana ask you to do? Caldwell prompted. DeAndre wiped a non-existent tear from the corner of his eye. She begged me for a pen and paper. She said she did not trust the estate lawyers because they always complicated things. She asked me to grab a notepad from her purse. I handed it to her along with my own blue pen. She wrote out that amendment right in front of me. She handed it back and said, DeAndre, you run a successful tech company. You understand how to manage assets and protect investments. Please make sure Harrison and Sabrina are safe from Naomi. She made me swear to protect them. In the gallery, Sabrina dabbed her eyes with a silk tissue, playing the role of the grieving, grateful daughter to absolute perfection. My father. Harrison nodded solemnly from the defense table, trying to look like a man burdened by his late wife's tragic final wish. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect lie, a deathbed confession, witnessed by a successful businessman with no direct blood relation, validating all of their vicious claims about me. Caldwell walked over to the court clerk and retrieved the plastic sleeve containing the forged document. He approached the witness stand and handed it to DeAndre. Can you confirm under oath and under penalty of perjury that this is the exact document you saw Diana write and sign on the night of October? DeAndre looked at the paper. He did not hesitate for a single second. Yes, sir, he answered firmly. I watched her write every single word. Thank you, DeAndre, Caldwell said, turning his back to the witness and offering a triumphant smile to the jury. No further questions, Your Honor. The judge looked over at my table. His expression was completely neutral, but I could see the slight tension in his shoulders. He knew who I worked for, which meant he knew the man sitting on the witness stand was likely lying through his teeth, but he had to let the legal process play out. Mr. Oliver, the judge said calmly, does the plaintiff wish to cross-examine the witness? Oliver stood up slowly. He did not grab the forged will. He did not pick up the medical records detailing my mother's heavy sedation. He simply picked up a thin grey folder, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward the center of the room. Yes, Your Honor. Oliver replied, his voice chillingly polite. We have a few questions for the heroic son-in-law. DeAndre sat up a little straighter, gripping the armrests of the witness chair. He looked at Oliver with absolute arrogance, fully believing he had just secured $12 million for his fake empire. He had no idea The ground beneath him was about to completely cave in. Oliver approached the witness stand with a completely different demeanor than Caldwell. He was not aggressive or theatrical. He looked almost bored, like a man casually flipping through a magazine. He stopped a few feet away from DeAndre and adjusted his glasses. "Good morning, DeAndre," Oliver said softly. "Let us talk about October. The night you claimed to have sat by Diana's bedside." DeAndre nodded firmly. "That is right, I was there." Oliver opened his thin grey folder. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to the bailiff, who then passed it to the judge and defense counsel. "What kind of car do you drive, DeAndre?" DeAndre frowned, clearly confused by the question. Caldwell half stood up from his chair. "Your Honor, objection, relevance. What does my client's car have to do with a deathbed? Will I promise to connect it immediately?" "Your Honor," Oliver replied smoothly, without taking his eyes off the witness. The judge waved Caldwell down, overruled. "Answer the question." "I drive a 2024 Mercedes G-Class SUV." DeAndre answered, a hint of his usual boastful arrogance returning to his voice. "It is fully loaded." "Fully loaded," Oliver repeated, nodding slowly. "That includes an integrated GPS tracking system, connected to your primary cell phone, correct? A system that logs every single location the vehicle travels to. For insurance purposes." DeAndre shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yes, that is a standard feature." Oliver pulled out a second sheet of paper. "Your Honor, I am submitting the GPS data logs from the witnesses. Vehicle obtained via a standard discovery request regarding his TechStart UPS corporate assets." DeAndre, according to this log, your Mercedes was parked in the long-term parking lot of Miami International Airport from October 12th through October 15th. A murmur rippled through the gallery. My father Harrison suddenly sat up very straight, his eyes locking onto DeAndre. Sabrina looked utterly confused. "That cannot be right." DeAndre stammered, pulling at his collar. "I must have let an employee borrow it. I flew back early. I took a cab from the airport directly to the hospital." "Yes, that is what happened." "I took a cab." Oliver did not blink. He simply pulled out a third piece of paper. He was dissecting DeAndre's lies with surgical precision. "You took a cab from Miami all the way back to Boston in one night?" Oliver asked, his voice dripping with polite sarcasm. "That is quite a commute. Especially since the hospital security logs, which I am now submitting into evidence, show absolutely no record of your name being cleared at the front desk at any point during the week of October." DeAndre was visibly sweating now. He looked desperately at Caldwell, who was frantically shuffling through his own papers, realizing his star witness was collapsing. "The security guards know me," DeAndre insisted, his voice rising in panic. "I am family. They just let me wave and walk right through. They probably forgot to write it down." "Is that so?" Oliver asked. He walked back to our table and picked up a large, high-resolution photograph. He carried it over to the jury box, holding it up so every single juror could see it clearly. "If you were sitting by my client's mother's bedside in a Boston hospital on the night of October," Oliver continued, his voice echoing through the silent room, "then how do you explain this photograph, posted to your own public social media account at 10:15 p.m. that exact same night?" DeAndre stared at the photograph. The color completely drained from his face. It was a picture of him sitting in a plush leather booth, holding a massive bottle of champagne with a sparkler attached to it. He was surrounded by 4 women, who were definitely not his wife Sabrina. The geotag clearly read Club Live Miami Beach. Sabrina let out a piercing gasp from the gallery. She slapped her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. She stared at the photo, then glared at her husband. That photo was taken weeks ago. DeAndre shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Oliver. I just posted it late. It is a throwback picture. People do it all the time. Oliver smiled. It was the trap snapping shut. Is that your testimony under oath, DeAndre? Because if you look closely at the television screens hanging above the bar, in the background of your photo, they are broadcasting a live college football game. Specifically the Miami Hurricanes playing the Florida State Seminoles. A game that, according to the national broadcast records I have just submitted, only took place on the night of October. The courtroom erupted. Sabrina was practically hyperventilating. She grabbed her purse and slammed it against the wooden bench in front of her. You liar, she screamed at DeAndre. You told me you were at a tech conference. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order over the chaos. Mr. Caldwell, the judge roared over the noise. You brought this witness into my courtroom under the pretense of validating a legal document. I did not know. Your Honor. Caldwell practically yelled back, throwing his hands up in the air and backing away from the defense table. I was assured the witness was credible. Leandre sat frozen in the witness chair. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. He had just committed perjury on federal record, and his marriage was disintegrating. Publicly in front of a jury, Oliver turned back to the judge, his voice calm and authoritative. Your Honor, we move to strike this witness's entire testimony from the record, and we formally request that the handwritten amendment be dismissed as a fraudulent document. The judge did not hesitate. Motion granted. The amendment is thrown out. The witness is excused and is hereby ordered not to leave the jurisdiction of this court. DeAndre stumbled out of the witness box, his head hanging low, as he walked past the defense table. Harrison grabbed his arm. My father was not angry about the cheating. He was furious that DeAndre had ruined their chance at the $12 million. The plan to use a forged will had failed spectacularly. Now Harrison had to resort to his final, most dangerous weapon to destroy me. DeAndre stumbled toward the back of the courtroom, his head down, completely ignoring Sabrina, who was quietly sobbing into her hands. The moment DeAndre was out of the way, my father sprang into action. Harrison was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly how to sever dead weight to save himself. Your Honor, my father said loudly, his voice trembling with perfectly faked outrage. He stood up and pointed a steady finger at DeAndre. I am absolutely appalled. I had absolutely no idea this man was lying. He came to me with that document, swearing on his life that my late wife wrote it. I trusted my son-in-law. He clearly fabricated this entire story to get his hands on my family's money, to fund his failing company. I am just as much a victim of his deceit as this court is. The judge stared at my father, his face completely unreadable. Caldwell, my father's attorney, wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Caldwell was desperate to distance himself from the perjury, nodding eagerly along with my father's denial. However, Your Honor, my father continued, his voice dropping into a somber, serious tone. DeAndre's unforgivable lies do not change the reality of why we are here. They do not change the fact that my daughter is a danger to this estate. In fact, her recent financial revelations only prove what I have been trying to tell you. The judge narrowed his eyes. Mr. Harrison, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt. I suggest you choose your next words with extreme caution. I am choosing them very carefully, my father replied. He reached into his briefcase one last time and pulled out a thick, blue-bound folder. He slammed it down on the defense table. I did not want to bring this into a public courtroom. I wanted to protect my daughter from total ruin. But she has forced my hand. Caldwell looked at the blue folder, visibly swallowing hard before picking it up. He carried it over to the clerk, who handed it up to the bench. "Your Honor," Caldwell said, his voice regaining some of its earlier theatrical volume. "We are formally submitting an active police report, filed with the Financial Crimes Division, alongside an impending civil suit. This report details a massive cyber intrusion into Harrison's commercial real estate firm. 6 months ago, exactly $4 million was systematically siphoned from the company's operating accounts and moved through a series of encrypted offshore nodes." The courtroom grew incredibly quiet. The jury members leaned forward in their seats, their eyes starting between Caldwell and me. "We have forensic digital evidence," Caldwell continued, gesturing toward the folder, "that traces the origin of this hack directly to IP addresses registered to Naomi's personal residence. She is not just a highly paid independent contractor. She is an active cyber criminal who embezzled $4 million from her own father." A collective gasp echoed from the jury box. Even Sabrina stopped crying for a moment, looking up with wide, shocked eyes. My father looked at me with a look of pure, unaltered venom. He had hired someone on the black market to fake this digital paper trail, attempting to frame me for his own missing money. "My wife Diana was a saint," my father said, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "She discovered what Naomi had done just weeks before she passed. Diana was devastated. She knew that if I pressed charges, Naomi would go to federal prison for decades. Diana left the $12 million trust to Naomi out of pure pity and maternal desperation. It was not a reward. It was a ransom. Diana wanted Naomi to have the funds so she could quietly repay the $4 million she stole and save herself from a criminal indictment." The narrative was diabolical. And honestly, it was brilliantly crafted. It perfectly explained why I suddenly had a high income. It explained why my mother left me the money. And it painted me as a cold, calculating thief who was now trying to walk away with the stolen funds and the trust. "We are demanding an immediate freeze on all estate assets," Caldwell announced, slamming his hand on the podium. "You cannot release $12 million to a woman who is currently under investigation for a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement. We have an expert financial witness waiting outside right now who can verify every single line of that police report." The judge looked down at the blue folder. The allegation of a felony cybercrime was massive. He looked over at my table. He knew I worked for the government. But a formal police report of embezzlement filed against me was something he could not simply ignore. On the record, I sat perfectly still. I did not show an ounce of fear. I turned to Oliver and gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. My father had just played his ultimate dirtiest card. He had officially submitted fabricated evidence of a felony into a court of law. He had just walked directly into the federal trap I had spent 6 months building. The judge pressed his fingers to his temples. He was clearly caught in a jurisdictional nightmare. But a formal allegation of a $4 million cyber crime presented with an expert witness could not be brushed aside in a civil court. He let out a long breath and nodded. "The defense calls Mr. Gregory Hughes to the stand," Caldwell announced, his voice practically vibrating with renewed confidence. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and a tall, severe-looking man walked down the center aisle. Gregory Hughes wore a stiff gray suit and carried a massive leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to contain a brick of lead. He had the sharp, unforgiving posture of a man who spent his life dissecting numbers and ruining lives. He took the oath and sat down, carefully placing his briefcase on the floor and adjusting the microphone. Caldwell immediately began establishing the man's credibility. "Mr. Hughes, please state your profession for the record." "I am a private forensic accountant and digital asset auditor," Hughes replied. His voice was monotone, completely devoid of emotion, which ironically made him sound incredibly trustworthy to a jury. "I have over 20 years of experience consulting for major financial institutions and commercial real estate firms, and you were privately retained by Harrison to investigate a massive financial discrepancy within his company," Caldwell asked, walking over to an evidence projector. "That is correct," Hughes answered. "In late May, $4 million and liquid operating capital was systematically drained from the company's primary holding accounts." Caldwell turned on the projector. A massive complex spreadsheet illuminated the screen, filled with hundreds of rows of financial data, routing numbers and timestamps. To the average person in the jury box, it looked like an impenetrable wall of intimidating math. "Can you explain to the court exactly how this money was stolen?" Caldwell asked, pointing a laser pointer at the screen. Hughes leaned forward, his eyes scanning the numbers. It was a highly sophisticated intrusion. The perpetrator utilized a series of encrypted bypasses to access the administrative level of the company's financial servers. Once inside, they did not take the money all at once. That would have triggered automatic federal banking alarms. Instead, they initiated 50 separate wire transfers over a period of 72 hours, moving the funds into 3 different offshore nodes. The courtroom was completely silent. The jurors were staring at the screen, completely captivated by the narrative of a high-tech heist. Caldwell moved to the next slide. It showed a map of network connections, ending with a single highlighted IP address in bright red. "Mr. Hughes," Caldwell said, lowering his voice to emphasize the gravity of the moment, "were you able to trace the digital footprint of the hacker?" "Yes," Hughes stated flatly. "The perpetrator used a virtual, private network to mask their location, but they made a critical error. During the final sequence of transfers, the mask dropped for exactly 4 seconds. We captured the origin IP address." "And who does that IP address belong to?" Caldwell asked, turning slowly to look directly at me. Hughes did not hesitate. "We subpoenaed the internet service provider. That specific IP address is registered to the residential router at the home of the plaintiff, Naomi." A heavy collective gasp swept through the gallery. The jurors looked at me with a mixture of shock and sheer disgust. The narrative my father had spun was working perfectly. I was no longer just an unemployed disappointment. I was a calculating criminal who had robbed her own family. Sabrina leaned forward from the gallery, her earlier humiliation over her husband momentarily forgotten. "I knew it," she whispered loudly, glaring at the back of my head. "I knew she was a thief." My father sat at the defense table, his hands folded under his chin. He had completely dropped his aggressive posture. Now, he was playing the role of the heartbroken patriarch. He looked down at the table, slowly shaking his head, as if the weight of his daughter's betrayal was simply too much to bear. It was a phenomenal performance, Mr. Hughes, Caldwell said, stepping right up to the jury box. "Based on your 2 decades of expert analysis, is there any possible way this was an external, anonymous hack? Could someone else have used her internet connection?" Hughes shook his head firmly. "Impossible. The perpetrator knew the internal accounting codes. They knew exactly which escrow accounts held the liquid Cash. This was a targeted, inside job, executed directly from the plaintiff's home network. Caldwell turned off the projector, leaving the devastating accusation hanging in the air. He looked immensely satisfied. "Thank you, Mr. Hughes." No further questions. The courtroom felt incredibly heavy. The tension was suffocating. To everyone else in the room, the evidence looked absolutely damning. Caldwell had just presented a bulletproof case. That I was a felon. He sat down next to my father, both of them sharing a brief victorious glance. The judge looked over at my table, his expression deeply concerned. He knew I was a federal agent, but the evidence presented was staggering. He needed me to dismantle this, or his hands would be legally tied. I did not panic. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out a small yellow sticky note, and uncapped my pen. I scribbled 5 short words onto the paper and slid it across the table to Oliver. Oliver read the note, his posture relaxing instantly. He buttoned his suit jacket and stood up, ready to completely obliterate the man. On the witness stand, Oliver walked toward the witness box. He did not carry a thick evidence folder or a laser pointer. He only held the small, yellow sticky note I had just given him. The 5 words I had written were all he needed to tear this highly paid expert and his fabricated narrative to shreds. "Mr. Hughes," Oliver began, his voice polite but incredibly sharp, "you painted a very vivid picture of a high-tech cyber heist for the jury. You presented complex spreadsheets and network maps. Let us talk about where that $4 million actually went. You testified that the funds were moved through encrypted nodes. Where was the final destination?" Hughes adjusted his stiff grey tie, looking slightly annoyed that he was being questioned by someone who did not seem intimidated by him. "As I stated during my direct examination, the funds were dispersed into 3 offshore accounts to avoid domestic taxation and federal scrutiny. It is a common tactic for cyber criminals." "Which offshore accounts specifically?" Oliver asked, taking a step closer to the witness stand. "In what country?" Hughes hesitated for a fraction of a second. He glanced at Caldwell, my father's attorney, before looking back at Oliver. "The accounts are located in the Cayman Islands." "The Cayman Islands," Oliver repeated loudly, ensuring. His voice reached the back row of the jury box. "A notorious tax haven for the ultra-wealthy. So according to your expert analysis, my client, who you, in the defense, previously claimed was a broke basement dweller, successfully stole $4 million and strategically parked it in the Caymans. Now let us talk about how she supposedly did it. You claimed you captured her IP address." Hughes nodded confidently yes. The virtual private network mask dropped for exactly 4 seconds. During the final sequence of wire transfers, we traced that IP address directly to her. You traced it to an IP address that you assumed belongs to her residential router. Oliver corrected him. Oliver walked back to our table and picked up a single sheet of paper with a certified watermark. "Mr. Hughes, you consider yourself a top-tier digital asset expert. Can you tell the court the difference between a standard residential broadband IP address and a dynamic satellite uplink IP?" Hughes narrowed his eyes. The supreme confidence he had shown just moments ago began to waver. A slight sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. "A satellite uplink is used for mobile or remote locations. But the IP address we captured resolved to a billing address, matching your client's home." "A billing address," Oliver said, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Not a physical location. That is a very amateur mistake for an expensive expert to make. Your Honor, I am submitting a certified registration document from a global Maritime satellite communications provider. It details the exact IP address. The defense just displayed on that projector screen. Oliver handed the document to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. Oliver then handed a copy directly to Hughes. Mr. Hughes, please. Read the hardware. Registration location for that specific IP address. Oliver commanded. Hughes stared at the paper. His face turned an ashen grey. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the text. He remained completely silent. Read it for the jury, Mr. Hughes. Oliver demanded, his voice booming through the quiet room. It is registered to a maritime satellite receiver. Hughes mumbled, his voice suddenly very small. Speak up. The judge ordered, leaning forward over the bench. It is registered to a private maritime vessel. Hughes said louder, gripping the edges of the paper. A 90-foot luxury yacht named the Ocean Queen. Oliver turned slowly toward the defense table, locking eyes with my father. And who is the registered owner of the Ocean Queen? Mr. Hughes. Hughes looked at my father with a look of pure apology and defeat. Harrison, Hughes whispered. So let me get this completely straight. Oliver said, pacing in front of the jury box. The $4 million was stolen using an internet connection, physically located on a luxury yacht owned by Harrison. The money was then transferred to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, a location where Harrison conveniently has multiple shell companies. And you came into this courtroom today to testify under oath that my client, who does not own a boat and has never been to the Cayman Islands, is the mastermind behind this entire operation. Hughes had absolutely nothing to say. He looked completely destroyed. Caldwell put his head in his hands, realizing he had just presented falsified evidence and a fraudulent expert to a sitting judge. My father was frozen. The elaborate, expensive lie he had constructed to frame me had collapsed. In less than 5 minutes, he had accidentally submitted the exact digital proof of his own embezzlement onto the public record. He tried to whisper something to Caldwell, but Caldwell physically pulled away from him. The silence in the courtroom was shattered by a piercing scream from the gallery. Sabrina had leaped to her feet, her face contorted in absolute rage. You have a yacht, Sabrina screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my father. You told me we could not afford to upgrade my house because the company was struggling. And you bought a secret yacht. The battle lines were no longer just between my father and me. The family was imploding, and the real chaos was just beginning. The courtroom descended into absolute pandemonium. Sabrina pushed past the wooden swinging door that separated the gallery from the main floor, her designer heels clicking loudly against the hardwood. She did not care about the judge, the jury, or the armed bailiffs standing nearby. She only cared that she had been played for an absolute fool. You told me the family trust was completely dry, Sabrina yelled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She marched right up to the defense table, where our father was sitting, frozen in panic. You told me I had to take out a second mortgage to cover the renovations on my house because your real estate firm was going through a massive liquidity crisis. I believed you, I cried for you. And the entire time, you were sitting on a 90-foot luxury yacht in the Cayman Islands. Harrison stood up, his hands raised in a desperate placating gesture. Sabrina, please, he hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward the jury box. Keep your voice down. You do not understand what is happening here. We can talk about this at home. There is no home to talk about it in. DeAndre shouted, suddenly finding his courage. He had been sitting in the gallery, thoroughly humiliated by his own perjury, but the revelation of my father's hidden wealth suddenly gave him a new target. DeAndre stood up, and pointed an accusing finger at Harrison. "You told me my tech company was your top priority. You gave me a measly $200,000 and told me that was every dime of liquid cash you had left to your name. You made me beg for that money. You made me forge a deathbed will for you, because you swore we were all going to go bankrupt if Naomi got the $12 million. Harrison turned perfectly white. The blood drained entirely from his face. Caldwell, my father's high-priced attorney, physically backed away from the defense table, his hands raised in the air, as if trying to surrender to invisible police officers. Caldwell knew exactly what had just happened. Leandre had just openly confessed to a conspiracy to commit fraud and perjury right in the middle of a crowded courtroom, on the official public record. "Shut your mouth, DeAndre," my father roared, finally losing his temper. "You are a complete idiot. You are ruining everything we worked for." "No, you ruined everything," Sabrina screamed right back in his face, tears of pure rage streaming down her cheeks. "You made us sit here and humiliate ourselves to steal my mother's money. You made me look like a pathetic beggar in front of Naomi. You have millions of dollars hidden offshore. Where did that money come from, Dad? Was it really stolen from the company? Or did you just hide it so you would not have to share it with us?" The jury members were leaning so far forward in their seats, they looked like they might fall out of the box. They were witnessing a wealthy, arrogant family tear each other apart over greed and lies. I sat quietly at the plaintiff table next to Oliver. I did not say a word. I did not gloat. I just watched them burn their own empire to the ground. My mother had always warned me that my father's greed would eventually destroy him. But seeing it happen in real time was a spectacle I could have never fully imagined. "Order," the judge bellowed, his voice booming over the microphone. He stood up from his tall leather chair, gripping his wooden gavel. He slammed it down once, twice, 3 times, each strike echoing like a gunshot through the room. I said order in this court immediately. Neither Sabrina nor DeAndre stopped yelling. They were too enraged to care about legal decorum. DeAndre was accusing Harrison of setting him up to take the fall for the perjury, while Sabrina was demanding the keys to the yacht and her share of the offshore accounts. The facade of the perfect wealthy family was entirely shattered. "Bailiffs," the judge roared, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "Secure the defendants and the witnesses immediately." 3 armed county bailiffs rushed forward from the back of the room. One grabbed DeAndre by the arm, forcefully pulling him away from the wooden railing. Another stepped between Sabrina and my father, pushing Sabrina back toward the gallery area. "Let go of me," Sabrina shrieked, swatting blindly at the bailiff's uniform. "You cannot touch me, I am a victim here." "I can do much more than touch you, young lady," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low and steady pitch. The entire room suddenly went dead silent. Everyone froze in place. The judge leaned forward over his heavy mahogany desk, glaring down at my family with absolute contempt. "You have turned my courtroom into an absolute circus," the judge continued, pointing his gavel directly at my father. "Mr. Harrison, your witness just admitted to a conspiracy to commit fraud. Your daughter is throwing a temper tantrum over a luxury vessel connected to a $4 million cybercrime. If any of you speak another single word without my direct permission, I will hold you all in contempt of court. I will have you placed in holding cells downstairs for the next 48 hours. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Sabrina swallowed hard, her chest heaving, as she finally realized the severity of the situation. DeAndre nodded quickly, stepping back from the railing and keeping his head down. My father slowly sank back into his chair at the defense table. He looked completely defeated and utterly terrified. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, his eyes darting toward Caldwell. But Caldwell refused to even look at him. The civil war was temporarily paused. But the ultimate reckoning had finally arrived. The judge remained standing. Until the absolute silence in the courtroom was so heavy, it felt suffocating. He slowly lowered his gavel, his chest heaving with barely contained fury. He looked at the bailiffs, who were still standing, firmly behind DeAndre and Sabrina, ensuring they did not move another inch. Finally, the judge turned his attention back to my table. He looked at Oliver, completely exhausted by the circus my family had created, but obligated to finish the legal proceedings. "Mr. Oliver," the judge said, his voice completely devoid of patience, "your client has been formally accused of a severe cybercrime by the defense, although their expert witness has just thoroughly discredited himself. Does the plaintiff have anything to present before I make a final ruling on the Diana Trust Fund?" Oliver stood up and buttoned his jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense has spent all morning trying to speak for the late Diana. They have presented forged documents and fabricated stories about her final wishes. We believe it is time the court heard directly from Diana herself. I call Naomi to the stand." I stood up from the plaintiff table. I did not look at my father, who was staring at the floor, or at my sister, who was still trembling with rage. I walked calmly to the witness box, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. I took my seat. Oliver approached the stand. He did not bring a stack of papers. He simply held out his hand. I reached into the pocket of my cheap sweater and pulled out a small metallic flash drive. I placed it in his palm. Naomi Oliver began holding the small device up for the judge to see. "Can you tell the court what this is?" "It is a heavily encrypted, military-grade solid-state drive," I answered clearly, making sure my voice reached the jury box. "My mother Diana gave it to me exactly 2 weeks before she passed away. She knew my father was monitoring her phone calls and her visitors, so she physically handed this to me while the nurses were bathing her." "And what does this drive contain?" Oliver asked. "It contains her actual final confession," I replied. Caldwell, still standing near the defense table, half raised his hand. "Your Honor, I object. We cannot verify the authenticity of an unlisted digital file." The judge glared at Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, you just submitted a forged deathbed will and an expert witness who lied about a yacht. Your objections carry absolutely zero weight in my courtroom today." "Overruled. Play the file." Oliver walked over to the court clerk's desk and plugged the flash drive into the secure terminal. He clicked a few buttons to route the audio through the courtroom's main speakers. I looked directly at my father. He finally raised his head, his eyes widening in pure terror as he realized what was about to happen. A soft click echoed through the speakers, followed by the sound of heavy labored breathing. Then my mother's voice filled the room. She sounded weak, but her tone was incredibly sharp and resolute. "If you are listening to this, it means I am gone, and Harrison is trying to steal the trust." My father physically recoiled as if he had been struck. Sabrina let out a small stifled gasp. "I have known for over a year that Harrison is laundering money." My mother's recorded voice continued echoing off the mahogany walls. "I found the banking statements for the offshore accounts in the Caimans. I know about the shell companies he set up with DeAndre. I know he has been stealing from his own investors to fund a secret lavish lifestyle, while telling the rest of us the business is failing." I confronted him. "Anne." He threatened to cut me off from my medical treatments if I spoke a word of it to anyone. The jury members looked at Harrison with absolute disgust. He was officially exposed as a monster. who blackmailed his dying wife. I knew I could not trust Sabrina. My mother continued, her voice softening with profound sadness. Sabrina is too dependent on his money. She would never turn him in. And I could not go to the police myself. Because Harrison has half the local precinct on his payroll. But I knew exactly who to go to. There was a brief pause on the recording. A shaky sigh. Then her voice returned, filled with immense pride. I found out what Naomi actually does for a living. I saw her federal credentials. She let everyone in. This family believed she was a failure. So she could live her life in peace. Away from her father's toxic control. She is the smartest person I have ever known. That is why I left the entire $12 million trust to her. It is not because I pity her. It is because Naomi is the only person on this earth who has the legal authority, the skills and the strength to completely destroy him. Take him down, Naomi. Make him pay for what he has done to us. The recording clicked off. The absolute silence that followed was deafening. My mother had just reached from beyond the grave to deliver the final, crushing blow. She had validated everything. She had exposed his crimes, his cruelty, and his blackmail. And most importantly, she had just publicly confirmed my true identity to a room full of people who were about to watch my father lose his entire life. I looked down from the witness stand at my father. He was gripping the edge of the defense table so hard. His knuckles were entirely white. His chest was heaving. The arrogant real estate mogul was completely gone, replaced by a cornered animal. Realizing there was absolutely no way out, for a few seconds, the only sound in the entire courtroom was the heavy, ragged breathing of my father. The silence was incredibly tense, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. Then the cornered animal finally snapped. Harrison slammed both of his fists down onto the heavy mahogany defense table with such explosive force that the sound echoed like a gunshot. Caldwell's thick leather briefcase toppled over, spilling documents everywhere. As my father shot up from his chair, his face was a horrifying mask of pure purple rage, the veins bulging prominently in his neck, as he pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. "That is a fake," he roared, his voice cracking under the immense physical strain. "It is a fabricated piece of garbage. She made it. She is a computer expert. Do you people not see what she is doing? Right in front of your eyes. That is an artificial intelligence deep fake. She synthesized her own mother's voice to frame me. She took audio clips of my wife and manipulated them to steal my money." The judge leaned forward over his high desk, his expression hardening into absolute stone. "Mr. Harrison, I am warning you for the final time to control yourself and lower your voice in my courtroom." But my father was completely beyond reason. The meticulously crafted persona of the wealthy, grieving widower, the man who had charmed investors and politicians for decades, had completely shattered. It left behind nothing but the violent, desperate man my mother had always known. In private, Caldwell tried to grab my father's arm, to pull him back into his seat, but Harrison forcefully shoved his own lawyer away. Caldwell stumbled backward, hitting the wooden railing of the gallery hard. The attorney immediately put his hands up in the air, signaling to the judge and the bailiffs that he could no longer control his deeply unstable client. "She is lying," Harrison screamed, taking a heavy, aggressive step away from the defense table and moving out into the center of the room. "She works for the federal government. She has access to digital technology. We do not even understand. She hacked my company. She stole my money. And now, she is using a highly advanced computer program to put lies into the mouth of a dead woman. My wife loved me. Diana loved me. We built this family together. The delusion in his voice was chilling. He actually expected the jury to believe his frantic, unhinged theories over the heartbreaking authenticity of my mother's dying confession. The jurors were physically leaning away from him, several of them looking genuinely frightened by his sudden outburst. I sat perfectly still in the solid oak witness box. I did not shrink back, I did not flinch. I did not even break eye contact with him. I looked down at him with nothing but pure, calculated pity. And that look of pity is what finally pushed him completely over the edge. "You ungrateful little brat," Harrison snarled, his eyes going completely wild with hatred. He lunged forward. He ignored the judge's screaming commands and charged directly toward the witness stand. His heavy footsteps echoed like thunder across the polished hardwood floor. As he closed the distance between us, his hands reached out, as if he fully intended to physically drag me out of the chair, by my throat right there in front of the jury. He never even made it to the first step. Two heavily armed county bailiffs intercepted him before he could reach the wooden platform. The first bailiff hit my father with a firm, tactical shoulder block, knocking the wind entirely out of him and spinning him around. The second bailiff grabbed Harrison's arms and twisted them forcefully behind his back, shoving him face first against the heavy wooden paneling of the jury box. "Get your hands off me," Harrison thrashed wildly, kicking his expensive, custom Italian leather shoes against the polished wood. "Do you have any idea who I am? I own half the commercial real estate in this city. Let me go right now. She is the criminal. She is the one you should be throwing in handcuffs." The judge was standing now, his face flushed bright red with anger, as he repeatedly slammed his wooden gavel. "Restrain that man," the judge roared over the deafening chaos. "Secure him immediately. Do not let him move." Sabrina was shrieking uncontrollably in the gallery, covering her face with her trembling hands, as she watched our powerful, untouchable father get wrestled to the ground like a common street thug. DeAndre had backed himself into the furthest corner of the wooden bench, trying his best to make himself completely invisible to the armed officers securing the room, even with his face pressed hard against the wood and his arms pinned securely behind his back. My father refused to stop yelling. He twisted his neck frantically, trying to look back at the judge. "Look at the police report," Harrison screamed, his voice echoing with absolute desperate panic. "Look at the embezzlement file I just gave you. She stole $4 million. The digital network map proves it. The offshore IP address proves it. The money is gone. You cannot let her walk out of here. Read the file again. She is a thief. I am the victim here. I am the victim." He sounded utterly pathetic. The powerful real estate mogul was now just a hysterical rambling man, begging a judge to believe a fabricated lie that had already been entirely dismantled by his own expert witness. The bailiffs yanked him backward, forcing him to stand, while keeping a rigid vice grip on his arms. The judge looked down at my father with absolute revulsion. My father had demanded the judge look at the embezzlement file one more time. He was about to get exactly what he asked for, but it was going to be the absolute final nail in his coffin. The bailiffs kept Harrison pinned firmly against the wooden paneling. His chest heaved as he glared at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. He had begged the court to look at the financial files one more time. I turned to Oliver and gave him a single sharp nod. "You want the court to look at the financial files, Harrison?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the lingering tension in the room. "I think that is a fantastic idea. Let us look exactly at where that $4 million went." Oliver walked back to the evidence projector and tapped a few keys on his laptop. The screen flashed, bringing up the complex spreadsheet that Caldwell's fraudulent accountant had displayed earlier, but Oliver did not stop at the fake IP address. He scrolled further down, revealing the final destination. Routing numbers. I directed my attention to the jury box. The jurors were completely captivated, hanging on to my every word. I was no longer the defendant in their eyes. I was the lead investigator, taking them through a crime scene. My father claims I embezzled $4 million. I explained, pointing at the screen. But if you follow the routing numbers, the money did not go to my bank account. It went to a corporate holding account in the Cayman Islands. And from there, it was systematically wired back into the United States in smaller, untraceable increments. The receiving account belonged to a Delaware corporation called Synergy Tech Holdings. I paused, letting the name hang in the air. I looked directly at DeAndre, who was sitting in the back of the gallery. He had been trying to make himself invisible, but the moment I said the name of his company, his head snapped up. Synergy Tech Holdings is the official corporate name of DeAndre's highly publicized tech startup. I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the room. DeAndre loves to introduce himself as a chief executive officer. He wears $30,000 watches. He tells everyone, including my sister, that he is developing a revolutionary software platform. But I have spent the last 6 months conducting a full forensic audit of his company. DeAndre's eyes widened in absolute horror. He realized I had not just been investigating my father. I had been investigating his entire network. Let me tell you exactly what this tech company produces, I said, walking a few steps closer to the jury box. Nothing, absolutely nothing. They have 0 software products on the market. They do not own any patents. They do not even have a functioning website, beyond a generic landing page. Sabrina slowly turned her head to look at her husband. Her face was pale, her makeup completely ruined from her earlier tears. DeAndre, what is she talking about? Sabrina whispered, her voice shaking. I did not let him answer. They have 0 employees, I stated firmly. I pulled their federal tax filings. There is no engineering team. There is no marketing department. The only people drawing a salary from this revolutionary tech startup are DeAndre himself and a series of phantom independent contractors whose banking details match my father's offshore accounts. The entire courtroom murmured. The pieces were finally clicking together. For the judge and the jury, it is not a tech startup, I declared, looking right at DeAndre. It is a washing machine. Harrison steals investment capital from his commercial real estate clients. He funnels it offshore to hide the origin. Then he wires it directly to DeAndre's company, disguised as venture capital funding or software licensing fees. DeAndre takes a massive cut to fund his lavish lifestyle, and then funnels the clean money back to Harrison. You did not build a company, DeAndre. You built a money laundering front. DeAndre could not take it anymore. The walls were rapidly closing in. He knew that lying in a probate hearing was one thing, but having a federal financial investigator lay out a complete money laundering operation on a public court record meant he was going to federal prison. He slowly stood up from the wooden bench. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at my father. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase and started edging his way toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. I need to make a phone call, DeAndre muttered to no one in particular, keeping his head down as he hurried up the aisle. I need to call my attorney. He was 3 feet away from the exit when the judge's voice boomed like thunder across the room. Halt right there, the judge commanded, pointing his gavel directly at DeAndre. DeAndre froze. His hand hovering just inches from the brass handle of the door. He turned around. His face covered in a cold, terrified sweat. "You are a sworn witness in this proceeding. And you have just been implicated in a massive financial crime." The judge roared, his patience entirely gone. "If you take one more step toward that door, I will have you arrested for fleeing the jurisdiction. Sit back down immediately." The two bailiffs standing near the exit shifted, their hands toward their utility belts, making it very clear that DeAndre was not leaving this room. DeAndre swallowed hard, his entire fake empire collapsing around him. He slowly walked back to the bench and sat down, burying his face in his hands. Sabrina slid as far away from him as she physically could, looking at him with absolute disgust. The so-called startup was destroyed, and my father was completely out of options. The bailiffs finally released their iron grip on my father's arms. At a subtle nod from the judge, Harrison stumbled forward, falling heavily into the solid oak chair at the defense table. His custom Italian suit was violently wrinkled, and sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes. He wiped his face with a trembling hand, trying desperately to reconstruct the mask of the powerful patriarch. It was a pathetic display. He was a man drowning in a tempest of his own creation. But his ego absolutely refused to let him sink quietly. "Your Honor," my father gasped, his chest still heaving, as he forced himself to sit upright. "This is all a massive calculated distraction." The judge stared at him over his reading glasses, completely dumbfounded by the sheer audacity of the man. "A distraction, Mr. Harrison. Your son-in-law just confessed to perjury. Your expert witness just linked you directly to a fraudulent cyber intrusion. We just listened to your late wife's dying declaration, accusing you of felony blackmail and money laundering. It is business," my father shouted, slapping his hand flat against the table. He was doubling down, betting his entire existence on one final bluff. "Corporate finance is incredibly messy. The firm manages hundreds of millions of dollars. We use offshore accounts for tax deferment strategies. We use subsidiary holdings. It is standard practice in commercial real estate. If the federal government or the Securities Commission has a problem with my ledger, my corporate attorneys will handle it in civil court. It has absolutely nothing to do with this probate hearing." Sabrina let out a hollow, bitter laugh from the gallery. "A tax strategy," she muttered, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You bought a 90-foot luxury yacht while I was begging you for a loan to fix my house." "Shut up, Sabrina," my father snapped viciously, not even bothering to look back at her. He turned his wild, desperate eyes back to the bench. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is using complex financial jargon to confuse this jury. She is trying to blur the lines, because she knows she is cornered. Even if my corporate structure is unorthodox, it does not erase the fact that she manipulated a dying woman. It does not erase the police report. She is still a thief, and she is completely unfit to manage a $12 million estate." Caldwell, my father's attorney, could not take it anymore. The lawyer stood up, his face completely pale, and began rapidly packing his thick leather briefcase. "Your Honor." Caldwell set his voice tight with undeniable panic. "I must formally request an immediate withdrawal. As counsel for the defense, I can no longer ethically represent this client in this or any other matter." My father sneered at the lawyer, waving him away like a bothersome insect. "You are fired anyway, Caldwell. You are an absolute coward. I have a dozen lawyers on retainer, who are 10 times the litigator you will ever be. Get out of my sight." Caldwell did not need to be told twice. He grabbed his briefcase and practically sprinted up the aisle, pushing past the heavy wooden doors and fleeing the courtroom entirely. My father was now sitting completely alone at the defense table. The isolation was incredibly poetic, but it only made him more dangerous. He genuinely believed that his wealth and his high-priced legal team could untangle him from the money laundering charges. Later, but right now, in this exact moment, he needed liquid cash to pay those lawyers and save his crumbling empire. He needed my mother's trust fund more than he needed oxygen. "I want a ruling," my father demanded, gripping the edges of the table and glaring at the judge. "I am the surviving spouse. I have submitted evidence of her incompetence. I do not care what audio tape she played. I demand an immediate ruling on this probate case. Freeze her accounts. Hand conservatorship over to me right now. Do your job." He was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He thought he was being commanding, but he just looked completely unhinged. The jury members were openly staring at him in disbelief. He assumed that because this was a county probate court, the judge was legally obligated to ignore the larger federal implications and focused solely on the will. He assumed he could bully his way to a victory and deal with the fallout tomorrow. I sat quietly next to Oliver, watching my father play his final desperate card. He had laid all his chips on the table, demanding the judge make a decision. He had absolutely no idea that the judge had already made his decision the second he opened that sealed envelope. At the very beginning of the trial, the trap was not just closed, it was permanently locked. The judge did not immediately respond to my father's frantic demands. Instead, the courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Once again, the judge slowly reached up and removed his reading glasses, carefully folding them and placing them on the polished wood of his desk. The intense burning anger that had previously the judge's face during the family screaming match was completely gone. In its place was a look of profound absolute pity. It was the kind of look a doctor gives a patient when there is absolutely nothing left they can do to save them. "Mr. Harrison," the judge began, his voice steady and remarkably quiet, "I am not going to grant your emergency injunction today. I am not going to freeze the trust accounts. And I am certainly not going to award you conservatorship over your late wife's $12 million estate. In fact, I am officially suspending this probate hearing indefinitely." My father stared at the bench, his mouth slightly open. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the judge's words. "What do you mean you are suspending the hearing?" he stammered, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. "You cannot do that. I am the surviving spouse. I have legally petitioned this court for control of those assets. You have a sworn police report sitting right in front of you. You have a duty to rule on this case. I have a duty to the law." "Mr. Harrison," the judge corrected him, "and the law dictates that a county probate court cannot legally process an estate when the primary assets are deeply entangled in an active federal investigation." My father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "I told you that is a civil matter. My corporate attorneys will handle the Securities Commission. You do not need to worry about my offshore accounts. Just sign the order for the trust fund. If you refuse to do your job, I will immediately file an appeal. I will call the district administrative judge and have you removed from this bench. I have political connections in this city that you cannot even begin to fathom." The judge did not look threatened. He actually let out a small sad sigh. "Your political connections are not going to help you anymore, Mr. Harrison. Your high-priced corporate attorneys are not going to help you either. You are operating under the extremely flawed assumption that you are still in control of this situation. You are not." My father gripped the edge of the defense table, his knuckles turning white again. He looked around the room searching for an ally. But he was completely isolated. Caldwell was gone. DeAndre was sitting in the gallery, looking at the floor in terrified silence. Sabrina was crying quietly into her hands, completely broken by the revelation of his secret wealth. "What are you talking about?" My father demanded, his voice rising in panic once again. "Why will you not just sign the order?" The judge slowly reached across his desk and picked up the thick manila envelope sealed with red tamper-proof tape. It was the exact same envelope Oliver had handed to the court clerk at the very beginning of the hearing. The envelope my father had mockingly dismissed as a pathetic stall tactic from an unemployed daughter. "Do you remember this document, Mr. Harrison?" the judge asked, holding the envelope up so my father could see it clearly. "The one you so loudly objected to earlier this morning. The one you claimed was entirely irrelevant to your life." My father swallowed hard, a visible lump forming in his throat. "What is it?" he asked, his voice suddenly dropping to a hoarse whisper. "When this hearing began, you stood in my courtroom and spent 20 minutes telling this jury that your daughter was a financial failure," the judge explained, keeping his eyes locked on my father. "You claimed she was a basement dweller who had never worked a day in her life. You built an entire narrative designed to humiliate her and strip her of her rightful inheritance." The judge paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. He looked over at me, giving me another slight respectful nod, before turning his attention back to the ruined man sitting at the defense table. "But you made a catastrophic miscalculation, Mr. Harrison." The judge continued, his voice echoing with finality. "You assumed you were the smartest person in the room. You assumed your daughter was weak because she was quiet. But the document inside this envelope proves exactly the opposite. I cannot rule on your probate case today because my court no longer has jurisdiction over you or your assets." My father slumped back in his chair, his face draining of whatever color it had left. "Jurisdiction," he repeated numbly. "What jurisdiction?" The judge placed his hand flat on the red seal of the envelope. "Federal jurisdiction, Mr. Harrison. This document is a classified federal directive, and it completely supersedes my authority. You demanded a ruling all morning. You demanded that I look at the financial evidence of your cybercrime. You are about to get exactly what you asked for, but it is not going to come from me." The judge carefully slid the thick stack of papers out of the manila envelope. The crisp white pages bore the heavy, embossed seal of the United States Department of Justice, right alongside the distinct emblem of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at my father, who was still slumped in his chair, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in reality. "This," the judge announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority, "is a formal judicial decree, lifting a classified federal gag order. Accompanying it is a multi-agency federal subpoena, specifically targeting your commercial real estate firm, your offshore holding accounts, and you personally, Mr. Harrison." My father blinked rapidly, trying to force his brain to process the words. "A federal subpoena," he whispered, shaking his head in absolute denial. "That makes no sense. The federal government does not just drop subpoenas in the middle of a local county probate hearing. Who authorized this? Who brought this into your courtroom?" The judge did not answer him. Instead, he slowly shifted his gaze from the defense table over to me. He gave me a highly respectful nod, essentially handing the floor over to me. The time for hiding behind a carefully constructed disguise was officially over. I stood up from my chair. I did not look like the pathetic, unemployed basement dweller my family had spent the entire morning describing to the jury. I smoothed down my simple thrift store sweater, the clothing I purposely wore to maintain my unassuming cover, and walked out from behind the plaintiff table. I authorized it, I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a blade. My father slowly turned his head to look at me, his brow furrowed in deep, desperate confusion. You, he scoffed, though his voice lacked any real power. You are just an independent contractor. You audit mid-level companies. You do not have the authority to issue federal subpoenas. I stopped in the center of the room, looking directly into his terrified eyes. I am not an independent contractor, Harrison, I stated firmly. That was a cover story, designed to satisfy your massive ego and keep you from looking too closely at my life. I am a senior forensic investigator for the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. Sabrina gasped loudly from the gallery, the sound ripping through the quiet courtroom. DeAndre buried his face deeper into his hands, groaning audibly as the reality of his own impending doom settled in. My father grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. You work for the government, he breathed, his chest tightening. Yes, I replied, taking a measured step closer to him. And I do not just work for them. For the past 2 years, I have been the lead agent, assigned to a joint federal task force, investigating a massive multi-state Ponzi scheme, operating out of Boston. We have been tracking millions of dollars of stolen investor capital, watching it flow through shell companies, fake tech startups, and offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. My father looked like he was going to be physically sick. The sweat pouring down his face was no longer from anger, but from pure unaltered terror. You spent years mocking me, I continued, making sure every single person in the gallery heard exactly how wrong he had been. You told everyone I was a lazy spinster who sat in her basement all day in sweatpants. You told Sabrina and DeAndre that I was a complete failure because I did not go to fancy galas or buy expensive cars. But I was not sitting in my basement doing nothing. I was sitting in my basement compiling a 6,000-page federal indictment against you. Every time you bragged about a new real estate acquisition at a family dinner, I was cross-referencing your fake ledgers. I said, my voice steady and relentless. Every time you wired money to DeAndre's fake startup, my team was logging the exact IP address and routing numbers. We built the entire case right under your nose. The only thing we were missing was direct, undeniable proof that you were the one personally authorizing the fraudulent transfers, rather than some scapegoat employee you could pay to take the fall. I pointed toward the evidence projector, which was still displaying the digital network map his own corrupt accountant had brought to court. And then I smiled. A cold, victorious smile that made my father physically flinch. You brought that proof directly to me. You were so desperate to steal my mother's trust fund that you hired a black market hacker to create a fake embezzlement trail. You legally submitted your own offshore routing numbers into the public record to frame me. You handed the federal government the exact puzzle pieces we needed to lock you away for the rest of your natural life. My father tried to stand up, but his legs completely gave out beneath him. He collapsed back into his heavy oak chair, gasping for air, as if the room had suddenly lost all its oxygen. He looked at me not as his daughter, but as the executioner of his entire empire. Sabrina was openly weeping now, rocking back and forth on the wooden bench, realizing that the sister she had bullied her entire life was actually the most powerful person in the room. I did not stop there. I walked over to the court clerk's desk and picked up the thick, blue, bound folder that Caldwell had so proudly submitted. Just an hour ago. The folder contained the falsified police report and the fabricated digital tracking logs. I held it up high, so every single person in the jury box could see it. Clearly you stood in this courtroom and accused me of orchestrating a $4 million cyber heist, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence. You brought a corrupt, expert witness to testify that I siphoned the money from your operating accounts and hid it offshore. You filed a police report claiming I was a calculating thief. My father could barely look at me. He stared blankly at the polished mahogany table, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic breaths. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute. Let me clarify exactly what happened to that $4 million. I continued pacing slowly in front of the defense table. I did not embezzle a single dime. On May 12th, my federal task force secured a classified warrant from a United States district judge. We executed a covert asset freeze on 3 of your primary escrow accounts because we had undeniable proof that those funds were obtained through investor fraud. I tossed the blue folder onto the table, right in front of him. It hit the wood with a loud, heavy smack, making him physically flinch. The money did not magically vanish into the Cayman Islands, I stated, making sure every syllable landed with maximum impact. It was securely transferred into a federal holding account, managed directly by the Department of Justice. It is currently sitting there, waiting to be redistributed to the hundreds of innocent families and small businesses you systematically defrauded over the last 10 years. The jury box was completely silent. The jurors looked at my father as if he were a monster. He was no longer just a toxic parent or a sleazy businessman. He was a ruthless criminal who had stolen millions and then tried to blame his own daughter to save his own skin. When the money disappeared from your ledger, you panicked, I explained, piecing the entire puzzle together for the court. You knew you could not go to the real authorities because an actual audit would immediately expose your multi-state Ponzi scheme. But you desperately needed a scapegoat to explain the missing funds to your board of directors. So you hired a black market hacker to fabricate a digital paper trail pointing directly to my residential internet connection. I leaned over the defense table, forcing him to look me in the eye. You thought you were framing an unemployed spinster, I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register that carried easily through the quiet room. You had absolutely no idea. You were fabricating evidence against a sworn federal agent who was actively building a criminal case against you. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on his high mahogany desk. His face was a mask of absolute disgust. Mr. Harrison, the judge said, his voice laced with righteous anger, did you knowingly submit falsified financial documents to this court today in an attempt to frame a federal investigator for a felony? My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lips trembled wildly. He looked around the room, as if hoping a trap door would open up and swallow him whole. He does not need to answer that, Your Honor, I interrupted, standing up straight and turning back to face the bench. The evidence is already firmly on the public record. By submitting that blue folder today, my father officially committed federal perjury, obstruction of justice, and fraud upon the court. He tried to use a county probate judge to legitimize a falsified police report. Sabrina let out another loud, pathetic sob from the gallery. She looked at our father, her face twisted in a mixture of horror and profound betrayal. You framed her, Sabrina choked out, her voice cracking under the weight of the revelation. You tried to send your own daughter to federal prison just to cover up your stolen money. My father finally snapped his head toward Sabrina. I was trying to save this family. He croaked, his voice sounding like dry sandpaper. I was trying to protect the business. You were trying to protect your yacht. I fired back, instantly shutting down his pathetic excuse. You were trying to protect your massive ego. My mother knew exactly what you were. She left me the trust fund because she knew I would find the missing pieces and tear your fake empire down. And the best part is, I did not even have to hunt for the final piece. You walked right into this courthouse and handed it to me on a silver platter. The absolute finality of my words hung in the air. The web of lies my father had spent his entire life weaving had not just unraveled. It had wrapped around his own throat and pulled tight. He had nowhere left to run and nobody left to blame. The heavy silence that followed my words felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the entire courtroom. Harrison slowly turned his head away from me. The deep angry red color that had flushed his face just minutes ago completely vanished. He turned a sickly, ghostly pale. It was the exact complexion of a man who had just watched his own executioner pull the lever. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, trying to steady himself. But his entire body was shaking uncontrollably. He looked desperately toward the front row of the gallery. Sitting right behind the wooden railing was Mr. Bradley, his senior corporate attorney. Bradley had been sitting there all morning taking notes, fully prepared to step in and handle any civil disputes regarding the offshore accounts, just like my father had arrogantly promised. But Bradley was not taking notes anymore. He was silently packing his expensive leather briefcase. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, to call out to the man who had protected his illegal business practices for over a decade. But Bradley did not even look at him. The corporate attorney snapped the brass locks of his briefcase shut, stood up and turned his back on my father. Bradley knew that representing a client who had just committed federal perjury and submitted fraudulent evidence on the public record was a direct path to disbarment. Without saying a single word, Bradley walked quickly up the center aisle, pushed through the heavy oak doors and disappeared, leaving my father entirely alone. My father watched the doors swing shut. The last shred of his arrogant delusion evaporated. He had no legal counsel. He had no hidden offshore funds. He had absolutely no way out. A loud, wretched sound echoed from the other side of the gallery. Sabrina had collapsed sideways against the wooden bench. She was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands covering her face, as her tears ruined the collar of her expensive designer blouse. She was not crying for my mother, or for the horrible things she had said to me. She was crying because her entire reality had just been annihilated. The golden child was suddenly completely bankrupt. She realized that her father was going to federal prison, and all the wealth she had relied on her entire was stolen money that was currently sitting in a Department of Justice, holding account. DeAndre sat frozen right next to her. He did not reach out to comfort his wife. He was staring blankly at the floor, completely paralyzed by his own impending doom. He knew that when the federal agents came for my father, they would be coming for him too. The fake tech startup was completely exposed, and his perjury was fully documented by the court reporter. I stood in the center of the room, watching the family that had tormented me for 3 decades completely self-destruct. For years, they had made me feel like I was the broken one. They had constantly belittled me, calling me a failure, because I did not conform to their shallow, materialistic worldview. They treated my mother like a prop, and they treated me like a burden. They thought they held all the power, because they had the money, and the loud voices and the expensive clothes. But true power does not need to shout. True power is quiet. It is meticulous. It is built on facts and undeniable evidence. I had spent countless sleepless nights tracking every single stolen dollar, ensuring that when this moment finally arrived, there would be absolutely no loopholes for him to slip through. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the spell that had fallen over the room. He looked down at my father with an expression of sheer disbelief and profound disgust. "Mr. Harrison," the judge said, his voice cutting through Sabrina's loud sobs, "I have presided over this county probate court for 22 years. I have seen families fight over money. I have seen greed and I have seen deception. But I have never in my entire career witnessed a man walk into my courtroom and attempt to use the judicial system to frame his own flesh and blood for a federal crime, simply to cover up his own massive financial fraud." My father did not respond. He could not. He was staring blankly at the wooden table, his chest barely moving. He looked entirely broken. "You came here today, demanding that I strip your daughter of her rightful inheritance." The judge continued, leaning forward over the bench. "You demanded that I look at your fabricated evidence. You demanded an immediate ruling. You brought this entirely upon yourself. I am officially ordering the court clerk to seal the complete transcript of this hearing and forward it directly to the United States Attorney's Office." The jury members sat perfectly still, watching the complete downfall of a local titan. They had walked into the courthouse expecting a boring hearing about a will and a trust fund. Instead, they had front row seats to the dismantling of a massive criminal enterprise. I turned away from my father and walked calmly back to my seat next to Oliver. I sat down and folded my hands on the table. My part of the job was officially done. The trap had been perfectly executed, and the prey was securely caught. All that was left now was the final, inevitable consequence. I had barely settled into my chair next to Oliver when the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. But the real threat to my father did not come from the hallway. It came from inside the room. Throughout the entire morning, for people had been sitting quietly in the very last row of the gallery. They wore plain suits and looked like board law students or random citizens waiting for their own hearings. They had not made a single sound while my family screamed and threw tantrums. Now they all stood up in perfect unison. They reached into their jackets and pulled out dark windbreakers with thick yellow lettering printed across the back. 2 of them read FBI. The other 2 read U.S. Marshal. The county bailiffs, who were standing near the exits, immediately stepped back and lowered their hands, recognizing that their local jurisdiction had just been entirely superseded by the federal government. The civil probate hearing was officially over. There was now an active federal crime scene. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Special Agent Reynolds, unclipped a heavy gold badge from his belt and held it up as he walked straight down the center aisle. He did not look at Sabrina, who was still sobbing on the bench. He did not look at the stunned members of the jury, who were watching with their mouths hanging open. He walked directly toward the defense table, where my father was slumped in his chair. Harrison Reynolds set his voice deep and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and multiple violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." My father did not try to run. He did not try to fight. He simply sat there, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table, as if he could somehow rewind time by refusing to acknowledge what was happening. His chest barely moved. The absolute crushing reality of his situation had short-circuited his brain. He had walked into this building, expecting to bully a local judge into handing him $12 million instead. He had walked directly into a meticulously coordinated federal trap. "Stand up," Harrison Reynolds commanded, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. When my father did not move, 2 U.S. Marshals stepped around the table. They grabbed him by his arms and forcefully hauled him to his feet. My father let out a weak, pathetic groan as they pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed loudly through the silent courtroom. It was the sound of his entire empire finally snapping in half. His custom-tailored Italian suit twisted and bunched awkwardly against the cold steel chains, pulling his shoulders down and destroying his powerful posture. "You have the right to remain silent," Reynolds continued, calmly reading the Miranda warning as the marshals patted my father down, checking his pockets for any contraband. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law." Sabrina jumped up from the gallery bench, her hands hovering in the air, as if she wanted to grab the federal agents, but was too terrified to actually touch them. "Dad," she cried out, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "Dad, tell them it is a mistake. Tell them to let you go. Please say something." My father slowly turned his head to look at Sabrina. His eyes were completely hollow. There was no arrogance left. There was no cunning businessman or demanding patriarch. He was just a tired, broken criminal who had finally run out of lies. He did not say a single word to her. He just looked away and let his head hang down toward his chest, unable to face the daughter he had manipulated and bankrupted. I watched from the plaintiff table, feeling a profound sense of closure. I had spent 2 years building the financial profile that led to this exact moment. I had traced the fake accounts, mapped the offshore transfers, and documented every single stolen dollar. But actually seeing him in handcuffs, wearing his wrinkled suit, while federal agents prepared to march him out of the building, was a completely different experience. It was not a feeling of joyous celebration. It was a feeling of deep, necessary justice. Oliver leaned over to me and nodded quietly. We had done exactly what my mother had asked us to do. We had protected her legacy. And we had stopped a monster from ruining any more lives. The judge stood silently behind his high desk, watching the arrest with a stern, approving expression. He had allowed the federal agents to remain undercover in his gallery because he knew exactly what was at stake. He knew that my father needed to feel invincible in order to voluntarily submit his falsified financial documents onto the official court record. By doing so, my father had not just committed state perjury, he had handed the FBI the final piece of evidence they needed to secure a federal conviction, without offering him any leniency or plea deals. "Take him out," Reynolds ordered, gesturing toward the double doors. The marshals gripped my father's shoulders and began marching him up the center aisle. He dragged his feet, looking like a man walking to the gallows. But the federal takedown was not quite finished. As my father was being escorted out, Reynolds slowly turned around and locked his eyes on the gallery. He looked directly at the man who had helped build the fake tech startup. He looked right at DeAndre. Special Agent Reynolds did not even blink as the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind my father. He slowly turned his broad shoulders and locked his gaze on the second row of the gallery. DeAndre was sitting perfectly still, his expensive custom suit suddenly looking like a prison uniform. The arrogant tech executive, who had confidently lied under oath just an hour ago, was now physically trembling. The sweat on his forehead glistened. Under the bright fluorescent lights of the courtroom, Reynolds gestured to the 2 remaining agents, standing near the back wall. "Secure him." Reynolds ordered, his voice echoing in the quiet room. DeAndre immediately threw his hands up in the air, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "Wait," he stammered, his voice cracking violently. "Wait a minute. I did not know where the money was coming from. Harrison told me it was clean venture capital. I was just the middleman. You have to believe me. He forced me to sign those corporate documents. I will cooperate. I will tell you everything you want to know about his offshore accounts. Save it for the federal prosecutor," Reynolds said, walking right up to the wooden railing, separating the gallery from the main floor. "DeAndre, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, and committing perjury in a federal proceeding. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." DeAndre did not try to resist. He was completely broken. He stood up on shaking legs and turned around. The agents moved in swiftly. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed loudly as they secured his wrists. The heavy steel chains completely dwarfed his $30,000 luxury watch. Sabrina watched the scene unfold with absolute horror. Her perfectly manicured life was vaporizing right before her eyes. First her wealthy father was hauled away, and now her husband was being handcuffed. Like a common criminal. She lunged forward, desperately grabbing at DeAndre's arm, but the federal agent smoothly stepped between them, gently but firmly pushing her back. "You cannot take him," Sabrina shrieked, her voice echoing off the high mahogany ceilings. "He is the chief executive officer of a tech company. We have a mortgage. We have car payments. What am I supposed to do?" DeAndre did not even look at her. As the agents marched him up the aisle, he kept his head bowed, thoroughly humiliated, as he was escorted out of the courtroom to join my father in federal custody. The doors closed behind him with a heavy final thud. Sabrina was left standing, completely alone in the gallery. She looked wildly around the empty benches, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She had no money, no husband, and no father to protect her. Then her eyes locked onto me. I was still standing calmly next to the plaintiff table, packing my mother's encrypted flash drive back into my briefcase. Sabrina scrambled through the swinging wooden gate and ran directly toward me. She did not look like the golden child anymore. Her expensive silk blouse was stained with tears, and her designer makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. "Naomi, please," Sabrina begged, her voice a hysterical, high-pitched whine. She reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my sweater, her fingers digging desperately into the cheap fabric. "Please tell them it is a mistake. Tell them DeAndre was just doing what Dad told him to do. You work for the government. You have the power to stop this. We are family. You cannot let them take my husband away. I will lose everything. I will lose my house." I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve. I did not shove her away, but I gently and firmly removed her fingers from my clothing. I looked her dead in the eye. My expression completely devoid of any sympathy or pity. "An hour ago you cornered me in the hallway, outside this very courtroom," I said, my voice quiet but razor sharp. "You told me I was a 33-year-old spinster who had absolutely nothing. You laughed at my scuffed shoes and my cheap clothes. You demanded I sign away $12 million so your husband could keep funding his fake tech company with stolen money. I did not know." Sabrina sobbed, her knees buckling slightly as she desperately tried to defend herself. "I swear I did not know about the money laundering or the offshore accounts. I thought he was really building a software platform. It does not matter if you knew about the corporate fraud." "Sabrina, I replied, stepping back to create a physical boundary between us. You knew he was lying about my mother. You knew that deathbed will was a complete forgery. You were perfectly happy to sit in that gallery and watch him commit perjury, as long as it meant you got a bigger house and I got thrown out on the street. You were perfectly happy to destroy me. Sabrina covered her face with her hands, wailing loudly. You ruined our family, she cried, her voice muffled by her shaking fingers. You ruined everything. I picked up my briefcase and looked at my sister one last time, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of closure. I didn't ruin this family, Sabrina, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. I just audited it. The heavy wooden doors were just a few feet away. 2 United States Marshals gripped my father's arms firmly, but as they reached the threshold, Harrison suddenly dug the heels of his expensive Italian leather shoes into the polished hardwood floor. He resisted the forward momentum with every ounce of strength he had left, turning his body awkwardly against the cold steel of the handcuffs. He was not trying to escape. He knew running was impossible. He just needed one last moment. He needed to look at me. Naomi, he called out. His voice was no longer the booming, commanding baritone that had dominated boardrooms and family dinners for the past 30 years. It was thin and cracked, completely stripped of its usual arrogance. It was the voice of a terrified old man, begging for his life. I stood near the plaintiff table, watching him struggle against the grip of the federal agents. I did not move toward him. I just waited. The entire courtroom was completely frozen. Even Sabrina had stopped her hysterical sobbing. In the gallery, temporarily shocked into silence by the sight of our untouchable father, pleading like a cornered animal. You cannot let them do this to me, Naomi. He pleaded, his eyes wide and frantic. He ignored the gallery, the jury and the judge, focusing entirely on me, as if I were the only person left in the universe with the power to undo his mistakes. I am your father. I raised you, I put a roof over your head and fed you when you were a child. You are my flesh and blood. You cannot just stand there and watch them take me away in chains. We are family. Please tell them to stop. The sheer audacity of his words was almost breathtaking. After everything he had done, after every lie he had told, and every piece of fabricated evidence he had submitted to a court of law, he was actually trying to invoke the sacred bond of family. He was trying to use the very concept of fatherhood as a shield against a federal indictment. Special Agent Reynolds stepped forward, ready to forcefully shove my father through the doors. But I raised my hand slightly. The agent paused, giving me exactly 10 seconds to finish the conversation. I owed my father absolutely nothing, but I owed it to myself to deliver the final word. I looked at the man who had tormented me for my entire life. I looked at the tailored suit that was now wrinkled and twisted around his bound wrists. I did not feel a single drop of anger anymore. The burning resentment that had fueled my investigation for the last 2 years had completely burned out, leaving behind nothing but cold, undeniable facts. You gave up the right to call yourself my father a long time ago, Harrison, I said, my voice steady and perfectly clear, ensuring that every person remaining in the courtroom heard my final verdict. A real father does not mock his daughter in public. A real father does not systematically drain his wife's bank accounts and threatened to cut off her medical treatments to cover up his own corporate fraud. My father opened his mouth to argue, to make another pathetic excuse, but I did not let him speak. And a real father, I continued, taking one deliberate step forward, certainly does not hire a black market hacker to fabricate a federal cyber felony. You did not just try to steal my mother's dying gift. To me you tried to frame me for a crime that carries a 20-year mandatory prison sentence. You were perfectly willing to lock your own flesh and blood in a federal penitentiary, just so you could keep buying luxury yachts and funding fake tech start UPS. You did not view me as your child. You viewed me as a convenient scapegoat. Harrison stared at me, his lips trembling. The desperate hope in his eyes completely died out, replaced by the crushing realization that his manipulation tactics had absolutely zero power over me. His shoulders slumped forward, entirely surrendering to the weight of his own crimes. You made your choices, I said, my voice dropping to a low final register. Now you get to live with the consequences. Goodbye, Harrison. I turned my back on him, completely, severing the invisible tie that had bound us together. For 33 years I did not need to watch him leave to know that it was over. Take him, Special Agent Reynolds ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. The marshals did not give my father another second to stall. They shoved him forward, pushing his weight through the heavy oak doors. He stumbled awkwardly, his head hanging low, his spirit entirely broken. The doors swung shut behind him with a loud, echoing slam that vibrated through the floorboards. The oppressive shadow that my father had cast over my entire life was finally gone. The courtroom let out a collective breath. The jurors began whispering among themselves, trying to process the historic downfall they had just witnessed. The judge slowly sat back down in his tall leather chair, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. The patriarch of the family, the untouchable real estate tycoon, was gone. He was no longer a threat. He was just another federal inmate, waiting for his cell assignment. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut. The echoes of my father's forced departure slowly faded into the high, mahogany ceilings. The courtroom felt completely different now. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had choked the air all morning was entirely gone, replaced by a profound echoing stillness. The judge cleared his throat, commanding the room's attention once more. He put his reading glasses back on and looked over at the jury box. The 12 men and women were still sitting in their chairs, staring at the double doors, completely stunned by the sudden federal raid they had just witnessed. Members of the jury, the judge said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of the morning's absolute chaos. I want to thank you for your time and your civic service today. However, due to the unprecedented federal intervention and the undeniable evidence of perjury and criminal fraud presented on the record, your services are no longer required to determine the validity of the defendant's claims. You are officially dismissed. The jurors stood up slowly. They filed out of the box quietly, casting lingering wide-eyed glances at me and at Sabrina, who was still slumped over on the wooden bench in the gallery. Once the jury box was entirely empty, the judge picked up his pen and turned his attention back to the plaintiff table. Mr. Oliver, the judge said, looking directly at my lawyer, the handwritten codicil submitted by the defense today is hereby stricken from the record in its entirety. It has been proven to be a fraudulent document tied to an active criminal conspiracy. I am throwing out all motions filed by the defense. This morning, therefore, I am ruling immediately on the core matter of the Diana Trust Fund. The judge pulled the original, thick stack of trust documents toward the center of his desk. I find the original trust agreement, meticulously drafted and properly notarized prior to the deceased's passing, to be legally sound, fully binding, and the true reflection of her final wishes. $12 million estate is hereby released from all temporary legal holds full control and ownership of the trust, are immediately transferred to the sole beneficiary, Naomi. The judge signed his name with a swift, heavy stroke at the bottom of the page, making it official. He stamped the document and handed it to the court clerk. The plaintiff's requests are granted in full. The judge finalized. This civil matter is officially closed. My mother's legacy was finally safe. It was completely shielded from my father's dirty hands. I felt Oliver place a reassuring hand on my shoulder. We had won. It was not a victory I took immense joy in, because the path to get here required watching my own family destroy themselves. But it was a victory of truth. Over decades of cruel manipulation, Oliver began packing his files into his briefcase, offering me a small, professional smile of congratulations. I stood up and smoothed out my cheap, thrift store sweater, the simple piece of clothing that had successfully fooled my family into underestimating me. I picked up my bag and turned to leave the table. My eyes naturally fell on the gallery. The courtroom was entirely empty now, except for the judge reviewing his final notes. The court clerk and Sabrina, my sister, looked incredibly small, sitting completely alone on the long wooden bench. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life looking down on me from a high pedestal, built entirely on our father's stolen money, was completely shattered. Her husband was currently in the back of a federal vehicle, on his way to a holding cell. Her father was facing decades in federal prison. The luxury home she had mortgaged against illegal funds was inevitably going to be seized by the government to pay back the innocent victims of the Ponzi scheme. Her expensive cars, her designer clothes, her country club memberships, everything was about to be stripped away. Sabrina had absolutely nothing left. She looked up as I approached the wooden, swinging gate that separated the floor from the gallery. Her bright blue eyes were bloodshot and swollen from crying. She did not yell this time. She did not hurl insults or demand her share of the money, like she had done an hour ago. She just looked at me with a hollow, terrifying emptiness. "What am I supposed to do now?" Sabrina whispered, her voice cracking and barely carrying across the few feet of space between us. It was not a demand or a threat. It was a genuine, desperate question from a woman who had never had to fend for herself a single day in her life. I stopped at the gate. I could have gloated. I could have reminded her of every cruel joke she ever made at my expense. Every time she joined our father in tearing me down, just to make herself feel vastly superior. But looking at her now trembling and ruined, I realized she was already serving her sentence. Her punishment was waking up tomorrow, in a world where she was no longer a wealthy princess, but the broke, discarded relative of convicted felons. "You are going to have to do what the rest of us do, Sabrina," I said, my tone perfectly even and devoid of any malice. "You are going to have to get a real job. You are going to have to learn how to survive on your own without stealing from other people." She let out a fresh agonizing sob, burying her face deep in her hands. The reality of a minimum wage existence was simply too much for her fragile ego to bear. I pushed open the swinging wooden gate and walked up the center aisle. I did not stop to comfort her, and I did not look back. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, stepping out into the bright marble-lined hallway. The air outside felt completely different. It felt clean. For the first time in 33 years, I was not bracing myself for the next insult or the next manipulation. I was completely, undeniably free. 6 months have passed since I walked out of that courthouse and breathed in the clean air of freedom. The bitter Boston winter has melted into a bright, warm spring, and my life looks completely different now. Today, I am standing in the sunlit atrium of the newly opened Diana Community Center for Financial Literacy. The walls are painted in warm, welcoming colors, and the sound of eager conversation fills the space. This entire facility was funded directly by the $12 million trust my mother entrusted to me. We offer free courses on asset protection, credit building, and financial independence for vulnerable families. We teach people how to spot financial abuse, so they never have to be trapped by manipulative predators like my father. Speaking of my father, his reality is a stark contrast to this beautiful, sunlit room. The federal government did not offer him any leniency. The sheer volume of evidence we provided, the offshore routing numbers, the falsified police reports, and the digital network maps left him with absolutely no defense. Harrison, the once untouchable real estate tycoon, is currently serving a 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He traded his custom Italian suits for a standard issue orange jumpsuit. His luxury yacht, the Ocean Queen, was seized and auctioned off by the Department of Justice, along with every other asset he fraudulently acquired. DeAndre did not fare much better. When the federal agents put the pressure on him, he completely folded. He tried to testify against my father to save his own skin, but his documented perjury in the probate court destroyed his credibility. DeAndre is now serving a 10-year federal sentence for his role in the massive money laundering operation. The fake tech startup is nothing but a closed file in a federal prosecutor's cabinet. And then there is Sabrina. Without her husband's non-existent tech salary, and without our father's stolen real estate money, Sabrina was left entirely to her own devices. The bank foreclosed on her heavily mortgaged luxury home within 2 months. Her expensive cars were repossessed. All of her high society friends suddenly stopped returning her phone calls. The moment the federal indictments hit the evening news, today Sabrina works the closing shift at a retail clothing store in a suburban strip mall, spends her days folding sweaters, organizing clearance racks, and dealing with rude customers for minimum wage. She is finally learning the value of a single, honest dollar. She wanted to throw me out on the street to protect her lavish lifestyle. But the universe has a very poetic way of balancing the scales. I walk through the main hallway of the community center, running my hand along the crisp, clean walls. Above the reception desk, there is a beautiful painted portrait of my mother, Diana. In the painting, she looks healthy, vibrant, and at peace. She knew exactly what she was doing when she handed me that encrypted flash drive. She knew I would not keep the money for myself to buy expensive things. She knew I would use it to completely dismantle the toxic empire that had suffocated our family for decades and build something profoundly good in its place. For 33 years, I allowed my family to believe I was a weak, pathetic failure. I wore cheap clothes. I stayed quiet during their cruel jokes. And I never defended myself against their relentless bullying. I let them construct a narrative where they were the powerful, successful ones, and I was just a tragic disappointment. But this entire ordeal taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Toxic people confuse volume with strength. They believe that if they yell the loudest, if they wear the most expensive brands, or if they constantly belittle the people around them, it somehow makes them untouchable. They rely on intimidation and theatrical displays to hide their deep, pathetic insecurities. But true power does not come from being loud. True power comes from being prepared. Real power is doing the quiet, grueling work in the shadows. While everyone else is busy showing off, it is gathering facts, analyzing the truth, and building an undeniable foundation that cannot be shaken by insults or lies. My father spent his entire life building an empire of sand, held together by sheer intimidation. It took just one gentle push of undeniable truth to make the entire thing collapse. I did not have to scream to defeat him. I just had to be ready. If you are currently dealing with toxic family members who constantly underestimate you or try to make you feel small, I want you to remember my story. Let them mock you. Let them think you are weak. Use that quiet time to build your own strength, your own independence, and your own undeniable reality. Because when the time finally comes to stand your ground, the truth will always speak, much louder than their lies. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button and leave a comment below, sharing your own experiences. Have you ever had to outsmart a toxic relative? I would love to read your stories. Please subscribe to the channel for more content about resilience, justice, and reclaiming your personal power. Remember, your peace is your greatest asset. Protect it at all costs. I will see you in the next video. The story of Naomi and her family teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of true power versus performative arrogance. 4 years. Her father and sister equated success and strength with volume designer brands and cruel condescension. They assumed Naomi was weak and defenseless simply because she chose not to fight back with the same toxic noise. However, the most dangerous mistake a manipulative person can make is confusing silence with submission. Naomi's journey beautifully illustrates that genuine strength does not need to shout to be effective. True power is found in meticulous preparation, emotional discipline, and the quiet gathering of truth. While her father and sister spent their energy tearing her down and desperately maintaining a fragile facade of stolen wealth, Naomi built an undeniable foundation of facts. When the inevitable confrontation arrived in the courtroom, it was not a dramatic, screaming match that dismantled her abusers. It was the cold hard evidence she had patiently and silently curated. This teaches us a vital strategy for navigating toxic relationships in our own lives. When dealing with manipulative or toxic individuals, engaging in their chaotic drama is always a losing game, because they thrive on emotional reactions and conflict. Instead, the ultimate defense is to protect your peace, deeply know your own worth, and quietly establish your boundaries. The truth, when properly armed and patiently guarded, will always speak louder than the loudest bully in the room. You do not need to prove your value to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. If you are currently facing toxic individuals who constantly underestimate your worth, take a step back today. Quietly build your resilience and let your undeniable success be your ultimate response.